Now we can begin. So I'm back here at Sarah this week. It's good for the final week. I was away in Chennai for a little over a week. So, uh, so this will be our final session of the establishing a daily practice. We've done 6 sessions now. And so let's see, why don't we begin as usual, just with some prayers and meditation. We'll just do a short prayers. Do you have them ready, Zella, or should I just do? Okay. Okay. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits of teaching the Dharma, I may become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. My merits of teaching the Dharma, I may become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. My merits of teaching the Dharma, I may become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. May, Mhm. May all sentient beings have happiness in its causes. May all sentient beings be free from suffering in its causes. May all sentient beings not be separated from sorrowless bliss. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of attachment and aversion. Okay, why don't we just do a short meditation now to begin. So, as usual, just sit quietly for a few minutes and then we'll start the teaching. Okay, so so as I said, this is the last session. I'm going to mainly just talk about some closing points. We've finished most of the general material. So I've put together some things today, and there's a little bit left over also from our discussion last week. Um, I had thought to begin at last week at the end of the session, somebody asked me a question, and I think I didn't give it much thought because there was not much time. But afterwards, it occurred to me to say a little bit more about that. And so this is I actually don't know who asked it because it was in the chat, but um, anyway, the question was about dissociation, and the reason I wanted to bring that up is I had responded because I had been talking about in the context of doing meditation on the energy channels and destabilizing one's mind potentially. And then so that I had that in my mind when I talked about it. So I'd responded very much as if somebody has quite serious dissociation, and I had given talking about sort of tools to use, um, such as alternative therapies or even Western medicine, things like that. But it occurred to me to mention that it's generally understood in the teachings on meditation that the first step in if we have any kind of obstacle to meditation is to apply an antidote in meditation. So if it gets so severe that the person cannot meditate anymore, then it can be good to do something outside of meditation, like the methods I mentioned, or even just simple things like getting up and walking around. But before that happens, if it's possible, it's good to try to apply the antidote in meditation. Um, so there's a couple things to say about that. One is that things like dissociation or distraction, things where the mind is not able to stay focused, then it's generally encouraged to use things like breath meditation that bring the mind back to stabilizing, more grounded in the body. So that would be a first step. And also another point to point out is that uh, with any kind of mental state meditation, ideally what we can create is a kind of space in the mind such that the the experience is no longer overtaking us. So some of you may have heard there's a analogy that's used traditionally. Actually, the modern master Thich Nhat Hanh, he had mentioned this often in his teachings. Is if you throw a handful of salt into a cup of water, then the water becomes very salty. You can't drink it. But if you throw salt into a pond or a lake, then it doesn't have much effect. So in a similar way, if your mind is quite more expansive, then when you have negative emotions or negative mental states or anything that is disturbing the mind, rather than it fully possessing your experience or becoming kind of identifying with it, it can happen in the space of consciousness, and you can allow it to be there without necessarily trying to push it away. Because any kind of mental state like that, like distraction or dissociation, it often is because there's something that the mind is not wanting to access. So there's it's understood in psychology that dissociation is often a reaction to trauma. The person is not wanting the mind to engage with an object, so they're going into a different space. But if you allow that to stay in the space of consciousness and focus on it and keep the mind in a stably focused way, then gradually it might start to unfold itself, and you can see what's going on behind it. And that's the best antidote in the end, is that the mind that processes itself. It allows to go through its own process that you can start to see and work with what's happening rather than trying to escape it or push it away. So that is the best thing if it's possible to do that. But again, if that doesn't work, if it's becoming overwhelming and it's even hampering your ability to function outside of meditation, then of course that's when the other methods I mentioned can be useful. Okay, so let's begin again with the slides. Okay. Okay, so here we have establishing daily practice session 6. Some of you might know Kandrala. I thought it would be nice to have a picture of a female practitioner this week. Every other week it's been men, and as some of you might know, especially if you're women involved in Tibetan Buddhism, it is a bit of an unfortunate situation that it's predominantly male. That has a lot to do with Tibetan culture. And also some degree also with Buddhist culture in general, but it's by no means something that has to be the case. The Buddha was quite clear that men and women are equal in terms of their ability to practice, and so it's good we have examples of female practitioners. And as Buddhism spreads in countries where there is more equality or more at least understanding of men and women having equal equal capabilities, then hopefully this situation will change. Okay, so we have training in the first four perfections. So this is completing what we talked about last week. This is the last 3 sections. We had gone through the Lamrim, and we were talking about each topic individually in the Lamrim just giving an overview of them and meditating on them. So we won't go into a lot of detail here. Obviously, these are quite a lot of subjects here in one slide. But here it's once in meditation you have meditated on bodhicitta and have the sense of wanting to achieve enlightenment for the sake of sentient beings, then these are the practices that you engage in that help to do that, to help to create that enlightenment. And so there is generally understood the method side and then the wisdom side. And these are all method side. And so in meditation, what you would do is just reflect on these points and think about how to practice them, to have some time in your mind to look at how you're behaving day to day and how much you're according with this. What could I do differently? And then the main thing is, of course, the attitude. It's understood that the perfection of generosity, for example, is to perfect the attitude of generosity. It's not possible to be able to give to everyone all the time. It's just we have to do within our means and what is available to us, but to have the sense that we want to share things with other beings. And so generosity, we have three kinds you see here. Giving material things is what we usually mean by generosity, giving money, giving requisites, and so forth. And then giving freedom from fear means saving the life of sentient beings. So nowadays, there's many ways to go about that. Traditionally, what that would mean is like buying animals that are going to be slaughtered and freeing them. But nowadays, that has become a kind of business. So for example, if you go to Bodh Gaya in India, then the local shopkeepers are aware that Buddhists like to liberate beings that are going to be slaughtered. And so they'll sell fish for the purpose of liberating them. And then people put them in the river and and the shopkeepers know where they put them and they go and catch them again and sell them again. So that may not be maybe it's good motivation, but we can think about really constructive ways. So, for example, protecting the environment, I think, is one way to think about that. Protecting animals that might be harmed or humans that might be harmed. Anything that might put people or other sentient beings in a situation of danger, then we can do something to countermeasure. And then finally, giving Dharma, which is teaching the Dharma. So, of course, we need to learn the Dharma to be able to do that. And it's generally said that giving material things is a practice mainly for lay people who have access to material resources and have income. And then giving Dharma is more for monastics who are learning the Dharma. But of course, it depends on the person. And somebody might be a very learned lay person who can teach the Dharma very well. And so it really depends on your means and what you're able to do. And then we have ethical discipline, so protecting trainings means that if you take particular vows, you take as a layperson, you have the 5 precepts. If you take bodhisattva vows and so forth, then guarding those, that's protecting the training. Gathering virtuous deeds is then practicing all of these things, practicing love and kindness, practicing virtue as a way of reaching out to others. And then finally, working for the welfare of sentient beings is doing actions that benefit others. So this is especially within bodhisattva practice. Ethical discipline is not just about avoiding harm. It's also about actively helping others. So there's a lot of guidelines within the commentary and the Bodhisattva vows of how to do this, working for the welfare of beings. If you look at if anyone knows about the Bodhisattva vows, and then you have the 18 root downfalls and the 46 faults, these are things that we try to avoid, and that gives us guidelines for what to practice. They're all related to these 3 kinds of ethical discipline. Each of them individually is one of those 3. And if you look at the commentaries, you'll see. For example, as in the secondary bodhisattva faults, then you have the fault of not going in aid when needed. So, for example, somebody asks you to come and help them with a construction project or something like that. It's not necessarily a dharmic thing, but if the point is, if you have the means to do it, and it's not obstructing anything else better that you could be doing, then you should do it. You should do something that helps people. And so that's an example of working for the welfare of sentient beings, whatever they need. And then patience. So tolerating suffering means that when we're patient, we're willing to go through hardship. That's something we need to be able to do to achieve much about anything these days, or any days. So we have to be able to be willing to not back down when things get difficult, and not retaliating to harm. That's usually what we mean by patience. Is that if somebody gets angry at us, we don't respond with anger. If somebody harms us, we don't respond by harming them back. And then forbearance of Dharma means that if we're patient with Dharma, we have to be very, very patient to have any kind of progress in our spiritual practice. It's not easy. And so if we expect instant results, that will be an obstacle. So here we have forbearance about that. And then finally, joyous effort. So this term is a bit hard to translate, virya in Sanskrit, which is related to the word virulent in English. So the strength of something. And then in Tibetan, sundru. So it really just means a sense of not backing down, of continually applying effort. But joy, of course, because of the definition of it in the traditional text, is taking joy in virtue, feeling enthusiastic about what we're doing when we're practicing virtue. Whereas effort in a negative, doing something negative is not considered joyous effort here. So you see here what are the three kinds. The first one makes that clear. Non-adherence to base activities. That means, so it's considered a kind of laziness if we spend all of our time doing things that are not constructive. So you might actually be very skilled in something and put a lot of effort into it, but if it has no benefit for developing your mind and practicing virtue, then it's not considered a proper activity here. So that's a kind of laziness that we try to overcome. So not getting involved in all kinds of counter activities. And then abandoning procrastination, that's usually what we mean by effort. We do things now and they'll keep putting them off. And then holding steadfastly to the path, that actually means that the opposite of that is quite interesting. It's considered a kind of laziness if we think, I can't do it and I'm no good. That is actually a wrong view. But here we hold steadfastly to the path, meaning we adhere to the possibility that we can cultivate this. We don't get caught up in this negative self-talk, which becomes a major obstacle. Okay, so next we have training the last two perfections. So these are considered much harder. Not that the other ones were easy, but this is about meditation. So we have calm abiding. I think we talked about that earlier, so I won't go into it too much, but we have the 9 mental settlings. This is what's illustrated in this picture here. This is you might have seen this. It's a common illustration of these 9 mental settlings or abidings. They're 9 stages of concentration that one goes through. You see in the early stages, the black elephant is with the monkey. This is symbolizing the unrestrained mind. And as it goes up and up and up, you see that gradually the mind becomes purified and stable. And then finally the monk is riding the elephant, meaning he has control of his mind. It's not that the mind is controlling him. And the 8 faults and 5 antidotes is just another way of presenting that. That's also illustrated in the picture. So the various faults, like not a laziness at the beginning, and then not remembering the instructions, and then especially laxity and excitement. Those are some of the major obstacles to even concentration. And the antidotes to that, I won't go into all of that now. It's in the Lamrim, but anyway, what you would do here, if you really seriously want to achieve calm abiding, it said that you should do single-pointed retreat to do that. But one has to be ready for that. When you really are at a stage in your practice that you're ready to develop that capability, then it requires single-pointed practice. It's not something that we can just develop whether an hour a day of practice. But at the same time, to have some kind of approximation of that, you can do little practice each day, at least to have a little more focus and calm. And then special insight is then analyzing nature reality with that strong concentration. So these 4-point analysis and the 7-fold reasonings refuting a person. These are ways to ascertain emptiness, talking about the nature of self and the nature of reality. And so there are different ways of looking at the way that our mind creates a sense of self and looking at whether that corresponds to anything in our experience. And for example, we look at, is the self that I talk about, is it one with my aggregates or separate from my aggregates? And we say aggregates, we could just think about body and mind. All right, and we look at the way that we can look at the way we use language because it's quite illustrative of how we think. So one of the examples that's traditionally given is look at the way we use the word I. When we say, for example, if I have a cold, I'm sick, I'll say I'm sick, right? I can also say my body is sick. I can say my hand is in pain. I can say I'm in pain. So it looks like we almost have a dual sense of something being mine and me at the same time, which doesn't make any sense logically. We have to look at, well, what is actually me, right? Am I my hand or not? Right? It should be a fairly straightforward thing. Everything either I is or is not something. Is my hand mine or is it me? Right? And similarly with the mind, we can say I'm crazy or I'm sad, or we can say that I'm feeling very sad right now, or my mind is really crazy, something like that. So who is me if I'm not my mind, right? It might sound like, well, this is just the way we use language, but we have to think, well, what we're talking, we say that reflexively. We don't have to reflect on it and um, decide this is what I'm going to say because, for example, and a counter example to that, I think what I've noticed sometimes, like we've had discussions here sometimes with scientists at the monastery and they're the Mind Life conference. Um, of course, there is a common view today in science that the mind is the brain. It's not a new view. It's been there for about 200 years. Um, and some scientists who have trained in that modality will actually talk that way. There was one scientist here, and she was saying, um, when I decide, oh wait, let me fix that. When my brain decides, and then she went on to say such and such thing, but you can see that doesn't come out naturally. That's from a way of training ourselves of thinking that my brain is deciding. It's not natural to think that way, but it's very natural to think this is my hand or I'm in pain with my hand, or to say my mind is out of control, or to say I'm crazy. So it's not something that comes from training in a particular way of thinking. It's a natural way our mind instinctively grasps. And so we look at what's actually going on there. Um, why is our mind creating that kind of situation? And does it correspond to the way things are? So we have to have a lot of concentration to be able to do that. We have to be able um, to see what's happening in our mind and see precisely what situation is creating, also in a way that doesn't disturb it. It's very much like science in this way that you have to be an observer who doesn't disturb the thing that you're observing. So you have to be like a spy that you can see this process happening in your mind without getting involved in it and thereby controlling it. So that's something that you cultivate both through concentration, and then you cultivate the ability and wisdom to be able to, within concentration, analyze these things without that disturbing your concentration. So those are both very deep topics, and it's not the main subject here. But of course, this is the culmination of the practice within the Lamrim. And then finally, we have the uncommon path of Vajrayana. So if you read any of the Lamrim texts, usually they'll have at the very end, like if you read the Great Stages of the Path, which is in Tibetan is about 800 pages. Similarly in English, I expect there's only one page at the end, the uncommon path of Vajrayana. So the point here is that this is we call Tantra practice, and I mentioned that last week that I'd talk about it this week. We have to understand what is the context for this within Buddhism, within Tibetan Buddhism. It's easy to misunderstand it. There's a lot of also misunderstandings, I would say, or at least different understandings in popular culture. And when I say different understandings, my point is that some of you might be aware that there's a lot of talk of there's even like tantric groups in America these days. There are many spiritual movements that call themselves Tantra. But most of those groups, as far as I'm aware, are not related to Buddhist Tantra per se. Tantra was a common practice in India. And if it's interesting to trace this historically, it's something that's happened since about the early 20th century, especially in America. And a lot of these groups were actually originally founded by Americans and Europeans. They were not founded by teachers coming from India or other Eastern countries and then giving teachings. Now, I don't mean axiomatically that means it's wrong. The point is that we have to look at what it's saying and examine everything in its own right. But we don't want to get in the misconception of thinking this has necessarily based on the teachings of Tantra and Buddhism and then mixing everything as one great whole. And so look within Buddhism what is meant by Tantra. And honestly, this is not something that was even clear, and for a lot of Buddhists. I think I may have talked about this I can't remember in the earlier talks about some of the history of this, that when Atisha came to Tibet, for example, in the 11th century, there was all kinds of misunderstanding. There were many different teachings that had come from India and had been adopted by the Tibetans, but nobody knew how it worked together. And there were all kinds of tantric cults that were practicing various things. Some of them were practicing human sacrifice, actually, which doesn't have much basis in the Buddhist teachings. But uh, it's the thing is that Atisha himself had also had a lot of experience with Tantra. He'd been an expert on this in India. And so he didn't just reject it and say that the monks, the correct practitioners, that the tantrikas, practicing of Tantra are just crazy. He actually understood that both of them had something valuable, but how do we put it together? What are they actually talking about? And so that has been an important part of all schools of Tibetan Buddhism. No school in Tibet, at least today, no major school is rejecting Tantra. They have various understandings of how it fits into overall practice. And Jay Tsongkhapa, the founder of our school, had a very specific way of understanding this. And in the Gelug school especially, Tantra is understood as mainly a practice for monastics. And lay people practice it too, but the point is that it's something that celibate monks practice. In some of the other Tibetan Buddhist schools, it's understood that to practice the most advanced forms of Tantra, you shouldn't be a monastic. You should be practicing with a partner. But in the Gelug school, it's generally understood as having to do with the way you meditate, the way you manipulate the energies of your body, and not about necessarily changing your actions. And so, just to give a very rough overview of so what is this distinctive about it? They say usually the main thing is that in both Sutra and Tantra, according to Tsongkhapa's understanding, again, this is different. If you study Nyingma, Kagyu, they'll have a different presentation of it. And I don't say one is right or wrong, but to understand how our school understands it. Then in Sutra or Tantra, the object of meditation is the same. We talk about emptiness. It's not that the Tantra talks about a different kind of emptiness. The difference is the consciousness that we use to meditate on emptiness. That Tantra allows somebody to access subtler levels of consciousness and to use that subtle level of consciousness to meditate on the path. It's understood that doing so is much more effective. It has a much quicker result. It's also much more potential fraught with problems. I talked about that before, that if somebody does that without being prepared, it is much more chance of destabilizing the mind because you're accessing these subtler levels of consciousness. Also within this, then there's an understanding that in the sutra understanding, which is non-tantric understanding, when somebody meditates in emptiness, then there's only the appearance of emptiness. When there's a single point of concentration in emptiness, then there's no experience of any kind of appearance to mind, of any kind of conventional truth, any kind of conventional form. That only when you come out of that meditation do you start thinking about conventional things and practicing generosity and practicing patience and so forth. But in the Tantrayana system, then it's understood that within the meditation and emptiness, you can also have the experience of conventional phenomena. That's when we do visualization of deities and so forth. That's what the purpose of the visualization is. It's very complex. It might seem, well, what's the purpose of this? And I don't believe in gods and deities and all that. That's not quite the point. It's that it's using whatever kind of thing we visualize, and we use a particular form that has a particular symbolism. But we practice doing that while the mind is in the space of emptiness. That is very hard to do, but it's a different way of training the mind. And it's understood that it brings much more control over the energies of the body. So eventually one is able to use that same kind of concentration to manipulate the energies of one's own body. Just to give one practical application of that, just yesterday there was some talk about this. We just had a discussion yesterday with some Western scientists that were here. There was a big seminar, and one of the Geshes, one of the teachers here, was talking about Tukdam meditation, which some of you might have heard of, which is when somebody is able to meditate while they're dying. And that happens not that infrequently in our monastery. I think I mentioned that last week. Um, just some of you might be aware, unfortunately, actually, just last week, the Ganen Treeser and Gache, one of the great teachers of Sarajay, and certainly a great tantric master, had passed away. So, as often occurs, then he was in Tukdam for about 5 days, meaning after he passed away, then the body just stayed in meditation without any kind of decay or what do you say, rigor mortis, things like that. So, what is going on there? And this is what this Geshe was talking about. It's understood that when somebody accesses these very subtle levels of consciousness, then they can withdraw the mind into the most subtle level of consciousness, and then even if somebody is not dead, this is what they practice this before they die. They're able to stop their breathing, and the mind abides in what's called the very subtle wind. Has to do with the energy of the body. So when they go through the death process, they do the same thing. So here, at least in the Buddhist worldview, they're not dead when that happens. They say 5 days after the person died. It really means 5 days after they stop breathing and they stop having any heartbeat. But they're not dead. Otherwise, their body would have decayed. And so the mind is still in a very subtle state before it separates from the physical body. So that is essentially the purpose of Tantra. The main purpose of Tantra is not to have a body that doesn't decay. Of course, that's a byproduct. But the main purpose is to access that subtle consciousness and work with that. Which again, this is why it's at the end of the Lamrim. It's not something that we just do right away. Here in the monastery, we spend 20 years, even more, studying and debating before we even begin to seriously do that kind of practice. It's only after monks have become Geshe, then they start studying about Tantra. And not all of them do that. They mostly study a little bit about it, but in terms of doing the advanced practices, it's something somebody has to very, very stable mind and be prepared for. So similarly, we just give a brief introduction to it so you know the understanding of how it fits into the overall path. But it's important to recognize where we are and not have a sense of, for example, there could be a danger that we get involved in Tantra and we forget about the other aspects of the path. We see that sometimes with practitioners in various places, that they'll take tantric empowerments and do tantric practice most of the day, reciting all these sadhanas and so forth. But if they don't have a understanding of the basis of the practice of the stages we've talked about, then it is unlikely to be very effective. It's like Lingua Gache was the teacher of His Holiness Dalai Lama. Some of you might know. He used an example in Tibet. They have hardened cheese, right? It's a staple Tibetan food because they're traveling, they're nomads, so they will dry cheese and create these little cheese cubes that last for a long time, and you have to suck on them for a long time before it starts getting moist again. So he used the example that practicing Tantra without an understanding of Sutra is like the hard cheese. It's not moist. It doesn't do anything. It's not malleable. So you have to have this basis, something to actually be some to give some kind of moistness to the cheese. Likewise, here you have to have something that will allow the practice to actually have something to work with. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of words, just a bunch of mantras that you're reciting that has no effect in your mind. It's like if we speak a language that we don't know. We say words, the words come out of our mouth, but it's not combined or correlated with any kind of appearance to mind of what we're talking about. Okay, so here in the uncommon path of Vajrayana, it starts with empowerment and devotion to a teacher. That is considered the root of it. It's not something we talked about that last week. There was a question about that. We don't just practice this on our own. It requires a relationship with the teacher, because that is the whole practice is based on this kind of. It's a way of kind of, they say, transferring the mind of the teacher. It's not literally that the person just implants their realization in you. That's not possible. But that we open ourselves to them, and it's like something about the blessing of the teacher allows us to progress much more rapidly if the teacher has these kind of realizations, rather than it just literally being that they say a word and we hear and we understand and we think about it. There's something more profound going on. That's not obvious, actually. It takes quite a lot of time to really reflect on what's going on there. And then the four classes of Tantra, you might have heard about this. Within Tantra, there are different stages. There's the action Tantra is the most basic, and that's generally something we tried to cultivate early on. So this is practices like Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara, Tara, and it's a lot more external ritual. That's why it's called action Tantra. So making offerings and so forth. If any of you do Numne practice, that is action Tantra. And then we have performance Tantra and Yoga Tantra, which are available, although honestly, they're not practiced all that much within Geluk, unless somebody is really an expert on Tantra and learns about all the systems. But then we have Tayist Yoga Tantra, which is the most advanced, and that is the practices you may have heard of, like Yamantaka, Vajrayogini. Some of you might know about these practices, which is much more profound and also a lot more esoteric. It's hard to really grasp what they're talking about. It has a lot to do with, again, manipulating the energies of the body. But here, within highest Yoga Tantra, we have generation and completion stage. Those are not general divisions. Those are divisions of highest Yoga Tantra. So generation stage is when somebody is practicing mainly visualization of a deity and a mandala. And completion stage is when they're working with the energies of the chakras of the body. Okay, so then the place of tantric meditation. I think I already talked a little bit about this, but so again, Hinayana, it's not always a very nice word to use because it is a bit derogatory. So we can say Shrvakayana, but the purpose here is within the understanding within Tibetan Buddhism that these are practices that are aimed at self-liberation, right? Whereas Mahayana practices are aimed at complete enlightenment. That's the first distinction, and we talked about that. So Tantrayana is a branch of Mahayana. It's not understood as something separate. It's not that we have a separate goal. And then there are two complementary paths within Mahayana. So we have Parimitayana. Paramita means the perfections. So the 6 perfections that we talked about just before. Whereas then we have Vajrayana, which utilizes secret mantra or tantra. Secret mantra is actually how they usually talk about it in Tibet. They don't usually use the word tantra. But I say that just because that's what most people are familiar with. In any case, it means the same thing. When they say mantra, they don't mean reciting mantras. It has a different etymology. And then, so the goal is the same, but the method is different. The goal is still enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings. But the method is different in the way that I talked about. So the first, the Paranimitayana, is called the causal vehicle. The reason being that we mainly think about it as, right now, I'm not enlightened. I want to be enlightened in the future. And then we start doing practices, creating the causes now that will happen in the future. And that's how we conceive of what we're doing. That is our kind of the narrative that we tell ourselves about what we're doing. Whereas then we have the latter is the resultant vehicle in Tantrayana. What this means is that within Tantra, we imagine that we are enlightened now. There's a lot of philosophy behind what does that mean. So there's a few things. One is, I think I mentioned last week, that it has to do with using our imagination. Our imagination is a very powerful tool, and we learn to use that as part of our spiritual practice. A second thing is that there's an understanding that we talk about the future enlightened being that I will be. In some sense, it exists now. If in the future we're going to be enlightened, and that being is going to have a mind that pervades all time and is aware of everything, then somehow that being is accessible to us now. We're trying to access something by imagining it and making it real. And also it's understood in Tantra that the main obstacle to being enlightened is our clinging to ordinary appearances. We believe that things, the way they appear to us as ordinary and mundane, is really the way they exist. So one way to counter that is through emptiness, is through seeing that the way they appear to us is not the way they exist. And that's a direct counter to that. That's correct. But it's just a negation. Whereas if we imagine that things are pure, that's actually not correct per se. but it's closer to the truth. If we imagine that we're enlightened, it's closer to the truth than imagining I'm just a defiled being who can't do anything and is incompetent. Neither of those is inherently true. There's no inherent self, but we're approximating something that's closer to the truth as a way of bringing ourselves closer to that. Um, and again, we don't want to take that the wrong way. We don't. Tantra shouldn't give us a sense of hubris or sort of unrestrained arrogance, where we think that I'm the greatest being in the history of the world, something like that. It has to do um, uh, with accessing something quite subtle in our minds. So that's why it has to be based on this meditation and emptiness. I talked about how you dissolve things into emptiness and then have the appearance of form. So within that space, you don't think me, I, in the strong sense that we usually cling to ourselves, is enlightened. We dissolve everything into emptiness, and it's almost like we're dreaming, that we arise, we're reborn as something, as an enlightened being, and we train in that and practice in that. But of course, it shouldn't preclude us from functioning day to day and being able to recognize ordinary things as they happen. Otherwise, we're making a mistake. We're going in the wrong direction. Okay, so then there's further distinctions. I think I did talk about this between paramita and vajrayana. So we have the object of meditation is the same, but the mind meditating in emptiness is subtle, right? So we're accessing subtle levels of consciousness. And then a meditator can manifest conventional appearances within the space of emptiness. So a person meditating can have the visualization of the deity and so forth without having to let go of the awareness of emptiness. Okay, now the transformation of desire, this is also a major part of Tantra, and this is, again, where there's a lot of danger of a misunderstanding. So we have here the picture. This is a example that's often used within Tantra, and it relates to a traditional Buddhist example of a lotus flower, which symbolizes enlightenment. But we see that a lotus is born out of mud. So it's understood that desire and afflictions, which are like mud, and it's important to understand that in Tantra, it's not saying that our afflictions are good. It's not that we just want to be defiled and confused and full of anger and attachment. But at the same time, we can use them rather than simply throwing them away. Like you can grow a lotus flower out of mud, you can use them and transform them in a skillful way. So in paramita, our afflictions are seen as something to abandon by a contrary antidote. That has a lot in the philosophy. When we debate this for so many years, it's something we take for granted after a while. We're used to talking about it that way because we debate mainly about sutra, and we talk about how afflictions are something to abandon. But then there are a lot of conceptual problems that come up with that. For example, is desire a mental state? What is a mental state? We ask, well, for example, does it just disappear? Does it have its continuum cut? So is it like your bad mind stop and your good mind goes on to enlightenment? Well, where do they go? Right? Does it just transform into something else, or does it disappear completely? And there are conceptual problems that follow from that. We think about examples in the physical world. Is there anything that just has its continuum cut? What the example they use, actually in some of the Hinayana sutras that we call them, or we might say I think it's in the Pali Canon. I can't say for sure, but it's what in the Tibetan canon of teachings, the sutras that have to do with self-liberation, they use the example of when you achieve liberation, it's like a candle going out. And they have 5 examples that they use that all have to do with something that just cuts its continuum. But this conceptually, well, what does that mean? Where does it go? Right? And really, then of course the problem is, well, does the candle not have a continuum? Is the smoke not the continuum of the candle? If the smoke is not the continuum of the candle, then where did the smoke come from? If it's not coming from the candle. So it doesn't seem that we talk about, of course, today in science about matter cannot be created or destroyed, or maybe energy cannot be lost, things like that. So how does that work in relation to mind, mental states? So in Tantra, there's an understanding that's quite different. That in some sense, the So you see here in Vajrayana, afflictions are understood as the manifestation of wisdom and are be transformed, not rejected outright. Our attachment, our anger, those are energy within our mind that are actually manifestations of our wisdom consciousness. We just don't recognize them as such. Again, the danger that comes from that is that somebody can think, well, then I'll just act angrily, and I'm just being enlightened. That's not the point. It's when you see the nature of how it actually is, then it can be transformed, and then you can advance much more rapidly on the path you practice this way, because the energy um, that was once destabilizing to you can actually be a benefit. This actually relates a bit to what I talked about at the beginning of the talk, that uh, if the mind is dissociated, you might want to try to have some kind of antidote to that, and get therapy or go for a walk or just focus on your breathing or something until it goes away. Or you can create more space in the mind where it just dissolves in and of itself. It's just energy within the mind, and it's actually very useful if we can harness that energy. But as long as the energy is out of control, then it's not very useful to us, and it just creates more problems. Um, so that's just a very general understanding of what's happening here, but to give an idea of what we mean by transformation of desire. Okay, so we've talked about Tantra. Now I just want to have a few things. These are mainly my own thoughts about how we can close and think about what we've talked about the past few weeks. So first, they have a dizzying array. You see the picture here in the top left corner you have all kinds of options, right? So Tibetan Buddhism presents us with a wide variety of practices and approaches. Right? If you go to a Dharma center, you might get a basic teaching, but then pretty soon you're going to see that there's all these different texts you can study, all these different courses you can do, all these different deities you can practice within Tantra. So even within just one school, such as Geluk, there are many deities, oral transmissions, so many methods. So we run the risk of becoming like an antique shop, a collection of relics that we can't actually put to use. This can happen. Somebody has practiced for years and years, and they'll say, I have this and this teaching, I have this empowerment, I recite all these sadhanas and mantras every day, but is it doing anything for your mind, or is it just a collection of information or things that we say? So this is a danger that we want to start at the beginning, try to make things real to us. And if they're not real, we don't have to feel that it's a problem to question it or to step back from it. We have to work with it until it's helpful for our minds. We're brewing the practice for ourselves ultimately, right? Of course, we're doing it for the sake of sentient beings, but that means we're doing it to transform ourselves, to help others. We're not doing this practice for somebody else's benefit, to be able to answer to somebody and say, I did the practices you told me, please now reward me. Really, it has to be that we get something out of it when we do it. We understand, at least to some extent, what we're doing and feel that it's beneficial for our minds. So here within that, we have commitments. Commitments, some of you might be aware of this. This is when you take, for example, a tantric empowerment. Sometimes the teacher will give this commitment. So you see in the slide here, I said, often after a tantric empowerment, a teacher will instruct the students to recite a particular practice for life. The purpose of that, of course, is obvious, that if you do a practice, you have to do it consistently. And the teacher wants to make sure that you commit to doing this. You're not just going to take the empowerment and recite it for a week and then just give it up and forget about it. So we have to commit to cultivating this. But the danger is if we commit to cultivating too many things, that we don't, again, it just becomes an empty recitation. So it is advisable not to take on too many of these commitments until we both have the motivation to engage in them continuously and are confident that we'll benefit from doing so. Here in the monastery again, some people might think that monks, because we have all the time in the world, then we can do these commitments all day. But most monks, until they become Gache, do not take many commitments. It's discouraged from doing so because our main focus is the lifestyle of the monastery. And it's a big obstacle if we can't attend monastery activities because we have to sit in our room all the time reciting commitments. And even if we do have commitments, a lot of monks don't put a lot of effort into it, a lot of energy into it. It's basically just something you recite to keep a continuity, to keep some kind of familiarity. It's like we can't practice highest yoga tantra right now, but we just maintain some awareness of it in our minds. We recite a little bit each day just to remember these points, but we're mainly focused on the things that are relevant to us now. And then when you're able to, you have more time and you're more advanced, you can start doing so. So yeah, I put this here. In the great monasteries, monks are discouraged from taking on many commitments until they have completed the study program. Now with the Geshes here, it's quite different. Like I just mentioned, Gache and Bache passed away last week, and as I understand, he was doing most of his day was doing commitments and reciting. He would get up, I don't know exactly, but probably 3 or 4 in the morning. That's what most of the senior monks are doing, and then they recite until 8 a.m. or so, and then from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. They go about their day, and then from 6 p.m. to 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. or so, they're reciting again. If in his case, it was something he understood exactly what he was doing, and it was very powerful. And also on certain days of the month, he would take the entire day to do certain practices that he had committed to do on a monthly basis. But it was clear to anybody who knew him, or I mean, I didn't know him personally, but as attending teachings, that it was knowing exactly what it was that he was doing. They say it's like somebody talking about a map. They said, just for example, we have Mysore nearby to us, as a city. Then I can tell you how to get there without looking at a map. I can just describe from my own experience of going there. So likewise, somebody like that, they're not explaining about it from a book. They're talking about it from their own experience of how to do these kind of things. Okay, so course overview. This is from the first day. I just want to review this because we want to see what have we covered and reflect on it, and if we missed anything. Also, there are a couple things that may not have time to cover. So the first we talked about the purpose and motivation, nature of the mind, and then different kinds of meditation. So that was a general introduction. Then we talked about the first 4 preparatory practices. So remember, we talked for the first 3 weeks or so, we were mainly focusing on that, about cleaning the space and having a proper motivation and having a correct posture, all of these things. So we see now why that was useful, even though it might have been a little bit tedious early on. We're creating space so we can engage in these practices every day, that there's some kind of sacred space within our home, within our mind, that we can do this. And then session 2, altar setup, temple setup, and temple etiquette. And then the 5th preparatory practice is reciting the 7-limb prayer. It's again almost an introduction to analytical meditation. We don't just focus on the breath at the beginning. We also think about certain mental states that we're trying to cultivate. And then session 3, the mandala offering. The 6th preparatory practice, which is supplication. And then refuge and requests, and then talking more theoretically about what does it mean to make the mind moist. We talked about it again today in the context of Tantra. And then the Lamrim lineage. Where did this come from? I give some history of it. So then in session 4, we really started talking about Lamrim meditation. So what is Lamrim meditation? What is placement meditation, analytical meditation? All right, which means focused meditation versus discursive or thinking about something. And then the threefold process of learning, reflection, and meditation. And then calm abiding and special insight, right? The 2 kinds of meditation, which is the culmination of placement meditation and the culmination of analytical meditation. And then focal object and aspect. So what does it mean? I'm not sure how much we got into that, but an understanding of when we take a particular object that we focus on and then analyze it in a particular way, that is the aspect. So then last week we talked about the general outline of the Lamrim, how to meditate on it. So what we didn't talk about, I realized, and somebody even asked about that, was the signs of progress and realization. So just to give very briefly about that, because at least one person obviously was interested. One of the main points here in terms of what are the signs, the signs are mostly things that occur outside of meditation. The point being that it's not necessarily a sign of progress if we have some kind of fantastic experience in meditation. The main sign of progress is that lasts, that outside of our meditation, we see some stable change in our mind. That is illustrated also nowadays by some of the scientific investigations into meditation. I think I did mention before this book, Altered Traits by Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson. It's quite a nice name for their book, actually, because the reason they have this is about 50 years before that, when the two of them had started studying meditation, they had put out a book called Altered States, which is a kind of was a popular term, especially in the 1960s or then in the 1970s. They were writing; it was still pretty popular. The idea that meditation is like a drug, that you go into an altered state of consciousness and you have some kind of trippy experience. But although that is useful scientifically to study, because we can see there are different kinds of states of consciousness that we may not have been aware of, if it has no effect when we come back to ordinary consciousness, then it may not be that useful. So what they were using as the measure of progress in meditation was altered traits, that the person, so there's some change in their personality and their behavior for positive. And that's similar here, that especially with the Lamrim, what is a sign of progress is that you're changing the way that you think day to day and the way that you use your time. So with the most basic meditation on precious human rebirth, ideally, when we do that, then we should then be able to use every day, every moment of our day, feel that I want to use this time well. I'm very lucky and fortunate to have the opportunity to be a human being and have this time to practice. So I don't want to waste it, and to feel less of a sense of I'm in such a bad situation. I'm poor. I'm uneducated. I have an inferior body or whatever. We're comparing ourselves to other human beings. And even so, for example, if we're in America, we're comparing ourselves to other people in a quite wealthy country. But if we compare ourselves to all people in the world, or even more, compare ourselves to all sentient beings, we see that we're quite lucky. The situation we have is pretty good, and to feel that I can use that well. So if we start seeing that naturally we think that way, it becomes more just, we don't have to force ourselves to think that way, then that's a sign of progress. And likewise with meditation on renunciation, which is the meditation on the suffering of samsara and so forth, then we start to see that we're less interested in things that are giving us just temporary happiness. We don't have to, again, we're not forcing ourselves. Somebody might ask you to go out to a movie or go out drinking or something like that. It's not that we say, oh, I can't do that, it's so bad, but that we just think, I'm not really interested in that anymore. I see something that used to interest me, but nowadays my priorities are different. And that's definitely a sign of having some kind of progress. Tsongkhapa gives a wonderful example in the Lamrim of the measure of having realized renunciation of samsara, which means the wish for liberation. He says in Tibet, so some of you might know Tibetan geography, there are four major sections of Tibet, and one of them is called Jangtang. Jangtang means northern plain. So the northern plain is, as it sounds, it's a pretty desolate area. There's hardly anyone that lives there, but there are a few nomads that travel around, and there's not much to do. There's plains for thousands of miles, and there's not, as a result, there's not much to eat there, right? You don't have agriculture or much, much in the way other than just yaks. Maybe they can have yak meat or the cheese and butter and so forth. But so the example is that there was a family living in the northern plain, and there was a young boy who wanted tsampa. Tsampa is the staple tradition to Tibetan food, which is a roasted barley flour, which I guess in the northern plain is hard to come by because you don't have barley fields. So what they had was turnips. I guess you can grow turnips up there. So the boy asked for tsampa, but the mother said, "I'm sorry, we don't have any tsampa. I'll give you turnips." And he started crying and said, "No, I want tsampa." So the mother tried all kinds of methods to get him to eat turnips. She cooked them in different ways: sweet turnips, sour turnips, maybe pickled turnips, whatever. But everything she gave him, he just complained and said, "No, I want tsampa." So Tsongkhapa says that's a good example of what our mind should be like if we want liberation. That everything in this world is just more manifestations of the same. It's all just turnips. So we see we keep meeting new partners and thinking this is the greatest person in the world and I'll be happy in this relationship. But here we see it's just another person who's stuck in samsara like me, and it's just more of the same. And there's a new movie out this week, but it's more of the same. It's just another Hollywood movie, a repeat, maybe a remake of an old movie. It doesn't satisfy anymore. It all feels there's something better that I want. This is the main point, right? If there was nothing better, then maybe we just have to try to make the best of what we have. But if in this case of this boy, he's really focused on sampa. So we think, I really want liberation. I really want to be the experience these deep states of peace and satisfaction that come through advanced meditation. And everything else just seems like more of the same to me. So if that thought comes to you naturally, that is a sign of really having developed renunciation. And then with bodhicitta, of course, the wish to achieve enlightenment, then it should be a constant sense almost all of the time of urgency to achieve enlightenment for the sake of others. That when we see sentient beings suffering, we just feel more and more strongly, I need to achieve enlightenment. I absolutely must do this. And then again, it's similar. It's actually a kind of renunciation. It's similar in the way that things don't interest us anymore because they seem very limited. But the goal is not just for oneself. It's a constant sense of responsibility. So actually, another sign of this should be a sense of responsibility for other beings. And that should also manifest in just worldly things, that somebody who is generally has a sense that I'm responsible for all of humanity or even all world beings in the world. It's not just me, and thinking about what's best for everybody in all situations, not just what's best for me and my own limited needs. So again, if that thought occurs spontaneously or even just more often than before, that is a sign of having some kind of progress. So we see it's not something esoteric, these signs of progress. It's not, it should be visible in the way in our behavior. And it also is, although it can be hard sometimes, it's very important as practitioners to listen to other people. And so when other people tell us, you do this and that, and I don't like it, that's good teaching for us, right? We don't want to say, no, I don't do that. I don't get angry, right? Well, it's not, if that's how it's appearing to other people, it's very important to take that seriously, even if they don't say it nicely. And even if they're wrong, right? Even if the person is saying, you're so angry, well, you think, well, I think maybe that person is mistaken, but nevertheless, we look at, well, that's how it's appearing to them. I can't deny that. And what can I do differently? And maybe there's some element of truth in what they're saying, even if it's only 10% true. It's still useful for us. Rather than getting defensive, then we block ourselves from learning from that. So this also comes from a sense of self-confidence, that we're willing to, we have enough sense of self-esteem that doesn't faze us. We're willing to accept that we have these faults and we can work with them because we have a sense that we can transcend them. It's not inherently who I am. It's not like I'm stuck to be this way forever. But if I want to change, I have to let myself be aware of it. Okay, so then we had today reflection and dedication. So we'll actually do that after the dedication, and then place of tantric meditation, and then a lifestyle to support practice. I think that's in the next slides I put that in, so we'll go on. Okay, so a lifestyle to support practice. I think we did talk about this, but again, a little bit of review and maybe some new things here. So find time, find time during the time. I meant find time during the day, right? So ideally early in the morning and before going to sleep. I'd mentioned that early in the morning is the best time, in my opinion, because your mind is clearer. You don't have the thoughts of the day. There's a natural concentration that can come. And if you're able to get up before anybody else in your home, if you have family with you or other people living with you, then you won't have distraction from that. And then also, if possible, before going to sleep. This will help us to sleep better, but also we have the opportunity to think back on the day and to think about, what did I do? And was it in accord with what I'm trying to practice? And then connecting with a qualified teacher. This is, if we really want to practice deeply, it's very helpful to do this. It's not absolutely essential, but it's best if it's possible. Now, it's generally said, again, that His Holiness the Dalai Lama even mentions this, that the best teacher is the texts. We have the traditional texts, the teachings of the Buddha, the teachings of the Indian masters like Nagarjuna, Shantideva, and those are those can be our teachers. If we don't find a qualified teacher, we shouldn't put ourselves in a situation with an unqualified teacher. But if we can find a teacher and they accord with those traditional texts, that's also important, right? That's one measure of them being qualified. We look at the teachings of the Buddha, and the teacher seems to mirror the qualities that are discussed in the traditional teachings. But if we find that, then we can gradually integrate the protocol for a healthier relationship. I may have mentioned some of that too, that there are all kinds of ways of etiquette towards the teacher. It's really important to take that seriously because these help us to get the most out of the relationship. So I put healthier relationship here. It's a nicer way to say it. This is Alex Berzin. Some of you might know he has written quite a lot of books. He has one, Building a Healthier Relationship, I think it's called, with a teacher. It's a good way to think about it because to us, it sounds more amenable, right? Rather than saying like a proper relationship, it might sound a little bit like there's only one correct way to do it. The point is it has to be beneficial for both sides. We have to engage in it in a way that's going to help us make progress. And another thing is to make a long-term plan for study, right? Like with anything, with spiritual practice, if we want to make progress, we have to think, what is the goal I want to achieve long-term? Not just I do this in this course now or read this book now. Of course, sometimes something just might come up. We have the opportunity, but generally speaking, we can think if I have 40 years left in my life, or if I have 20 years left in my life, whatever number of years, I don't know, but estimating if I manage to live a reasonable time, then what do I want to have done by the time it's over? Right? And thinking, what steps can I take that I can gradually understand a little more over time? And if it's possible, then join a community and study together without their support. That's helpful for a number of reasons. It's helpful for gaining more deeper understanding that people can challenge us. It's very helpful if we don't understand, somebody points it out to us. But also that we can ask other people. We have somebody to say, well, I don't understand this. Can you help me? And also that being with a community is supportive. The Buddha was very strong about that. He talked about that. That's essential for making progress on a spiritual path, is to have supportive friends. Wherever we are, we generally will have friends, unless we're very much an introverted person. So it's good if we can have friends who share that commitment with us. Otherwise, if we're forced to find friends because we just need social contact, but they don't support that, then it can detract very much from our practice. So we can end up in a community where people are going in the same direction as us. Also, I heard something recent, just yesterday, I mentioned there was a science seminar here, and there's a Dutch woman who has done a lot of study now. She's a neuroscientist, a neurologist. She's done a lot of study of the monks and analyzing what's going on when they debate. She's taken a strong interest in that. And what did she say? Yeah, she said that she's done a lot of study into mind wandering, and when do people's minds become distracted? And she said that ordinary people, most of the time, their mind is distracted about 40 to 50% of the time. But she said when people are interacting with another person, on average, they're only distracted about 10% of the time. So I never heard that, but that's quite interesting to think about the way that we study here. We debate so much. We spend 6 hours a day sometimes debating. I definitely, as soon as she said that, I thought about it. It accords with my own experience that if we debate something, we remember it much better because our mind stays focused on the topic rather than trying to read it, but your mind is going to all other subjects. When you're debating, you're forced to respond to the person right away. So it keeps your mind very focused. So that's another big advantage of being in a community and discussing these things. Okay, so then minimize distractions, of course, is I've said this several times. This is essential. It's very hard nowadays with all of the things that are coming up that can distract us. So the first thing I have here, of course, is devices and other technology. I can't say enough about how much I think that is a danger for spiritual practice. And nowadays, even for us here, it can easily derail us. We talk about people who are distracted 40 to 50% of the time. I would say with the phone, it's even more so, right? If you're searching on the internet and even useful things, I find like I often read articles, Wikipedia or other websites where they give a lot of background about something. But one of the it's both beneficial and harmful if you can click on a link to find about something else, but then you go to some other site and you're reading about that. You go to some other site reading about that. You don't stay as focused on the topic that you're reading about. I actually had read that this was in Scientific American some years ago. They done a study, and it shows quite clearly that people, if they read a book, a physical book, their memory of what they read is much better than if they read it on a tablet or something like that. They think one of the reasons for that, which I also, it resonates with my own experience of this, is that if you read a book, there's two sides of the page, and you tend to remember where something was on the page in relation to something else. Whereas if you're just scrolling down, there's no things don't stay in the same place, so your mind doesn't create a mental picture of what you're reading. I don't know about other people, but for me anyway, I memorize things very much in a visual way. I tend to remember on a book what side of the page it was on. And then I can search. If I know it's on the right side and the bottom, I can just look at every page, skim them to the right side of the bottom and get to that. So that's one reason, but I think there are many other reasons why using technology can actually create obstacles for distraction this way. But it is like anything, it's a useful tool if we can use it. Right now, we're having this conversation on Zoom. We wouldn't be doing that, the technology. It's a matter of not letting it control us. We have to use it in a healthy way. And then minimize distraction from unsupportive friends. I talked about that before. That can, even if people are kind to us and friendly, but if they're not sharing our interests, it can take a lot of our time. So we have to think about how can we, if we really are serious about the practice, without being antisocial or without being rude to others, the way that we can carve out time for ourselves, really substantial amounts of time to engage in practice. And then harmful substances and unhealthy habits. Of course, in Buddhism, generally speaking, any kind of illicit substance, so alcohol, drugs, or anything, the Buddha was quite clear that he thought that was a major obstacle. He said, basically, blanketly, not to use that. We think about, well, why? Of course, I said in the previous slide somewhere, I talked about drug experience, and yes, some people do, and it's indeed true that some people use drugs and it turns them on to spiritual practice. But maybe that first time, maybe it did so, but in the long term, it's questionable if it's going to be sustainable, because what we're trying to cultivate most of all with spiritual practice is clarity and control of the mind. And this is quite the opposite. If we're making the mind less clear and less controlled, and even if sometimes in drug experiences people have some kind of moment of clarity, it's not as, you don't have control over it in the way that you would if you would develop that through meditation. And then unhealthy habits, anything else. So just eating properly, sleeping properly, those are useful. It's considered actually virtue, part of the path, if we use those to support our practice. And then any kind of unsupportive activities. We have to think in our life, as we said, in terms of the practice of joyous effort, it's considered a kind of laziness if we spend a lot of time cultivating something that's not actually supportive to the goal that we're trying to cultivate. Okay, making time for retreat. So yeah, I thought I have this picture actually. This is a picture of me back in 2016. It's very unusual that somebody would take a picture of me in retreat for obvious reasons, because nobody else there. But that year I was in Maritika in Nepal, and I visited this cave there every day, and somebody I knew happened to see me and took a picture of me, and then later sent it on to me. So I thought it'd be nice to share that, because that's been something I personally, for me, every year doing some retreat has been essential to maintaining continuity of this practice. Because even in the monastery, as I said, we're very busy, but when you're in retreat, you have single-pointedly, you're with yourself. You don't have, you're not concerned about what's happening day to day, and the person said this, and I think this or that. You have more time to really focus on your own mind. So it's something I would highly recommend or encourage people if they have time to do that. So retreat is your time to work closely with your mind and develop a relationship with your inner world. That's another way to put it. Is I sometimes tell people that as a monastic, of course, we don't have family, but in some sense, your mind becomes your family. when you go into retreat, it's like coming home to something that you've cultivated, that is waiting for you again, and it's there for you. It's much more stable. It won't let you down. So you start to build that kind of relationship. I even put that here. Eventually, your mind will become like your family, your source of refuge. And also, the best research into meditation, this is scientific research, suggests that intensive retreat is more effective than short daily practice over a long time. So that's also an important point, that if you really want to have some kind of experience, um, then if you can focus on it intensively for a week, for 2 weeks, even a month, then it's much more likely you'll have some kind of positive change than if it's just a little bit each day, even if it's the same total number of hours that you're doing, if it's done in this focused period. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue with a day-to-day practice, of course, to maintain continuity, but to go deeper into it, it's really helpful if you find here. But if you're new to the practice, it's generally encouraged to do group retreat because the structure will help you, the support of the peers will help you. But as you get more advanced, it can be helpful to do solitary retreat. Personally, I really prefer doing it alone, just because, again, if I'm with people, there's still just other thoughts that come into the mind. It's harder for me, I find, to bring the mind into focused space when I'm seeing other people and I know that they're in the room, even if my eyes are closed. It's somehow different, the experience of doing that. Okay, so now we have Manjushi's 3 points of advice. I think I said I would cover that this week. This is when I think I said Tsongkhapa had said he had had an experience of the deity Manjushri, who gave him advice directly. So this is what the Manjushri said to him: if you want to have, because the context of this was Tsongkhapa was asking some questions about the view of emptiness, and Manjushri gave him some quite profound teaching, and Tsongkhapa said, I don't understand this. So Manjushri said, well, you can understand, but this is how you'll get there. So it was make single-pointed request to the Lama inseparable from the meditational deities. We talked about within the 6 preparatory practices, the practice of requesting, right? It's kind of making that, even if we think about it not just as prayer, but making this our goal, that we're making a single-pointed aspiration to be able to do this. And we visualize our own teacher as inseparable from this enlightened consciousness. This will create that experience in our mind. And then exert yourself in the accumulation of merit and purification of past negativity. So this, in Tsongkhapa's case anyway, this involved a lot of prostrations and mandala offerings. We talked about mandala offering in the 3rd talk. It said that he performed, I think, 1.5 million prostrations on a stone surface. It said that if you go there today, that cave, then there's still some indent where he had been doing the prostrations. And then performing the mandala offering, again, with just stone slabs. They didn't have much. They wasn't the kind of material we have today. You can just buy a mandala set. Of course, the story is that then by doing this practice with wiping the mandala off, then his wrist gradually got calloused and was cracking and bleeding, but they kept doing the practice. And then engage in judicious scrutiny of the classical Indian text. So this is a little different, right? So here it was mainly meditational practices, but here it basically study very intensively. It's really important to understand the Buddhist teachings. Again, this is, for a lot of people, this is challenging. Some people, it might actually be welcome. Some people would like to study and think about things, but a lot of us feel that meditation is something where we take ourselves out of that space. But in our tradition anyway, it's really important to understand the teaching and precisely what it's saying. Otherwise, we can get on the wrong track. It doesn't mean we always study. We can bring that into meditation, but we have to have that knowledge in our minds. And then we have something to work with in our meditation. Okay, so dedication, I put this together. This is just a prayer from Tsongkhapa. I was thinking we could do the dedication together. Oh yeah, it is already 8. It's the end of the time here. So, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that because it's a bit long and it's important that people have time for question and answer. So let me open it up to that. And then if there's time at the end, we can also do the dedication. Yes, Cynthia.
Hi, Venerable Gache. Thank you for your teachings. Really appreciate it. I have a question on the Paramitayana and Tantrayana. Because I haven't done my Tantrayana, but still wondering if I'm ready. So, based on what you said, because these are two methods,
Yes, hello.
this,
If you're having trouble
are you
communicating, if
are you
there's no
able
the
to
sound
hear
is
me?
working, you can also write it in the
Sorry,
chat.
are you able to hear me? Hello, hello. Can you? Okay.
Cynthia, I can hear you, but Venerable, can you hear Cynthia? Venerable,
Venerable, can you hear me?
No?
Can you
No.
hear
Is
us?
anyone else hearing it? I'm not hearing anything.
Okay.
Hmm.
We can hear you,
Oh, okay.
but
I don't hear you actually. I wonder.
Okay.
I wonder what's going on. Maybe this
But-
my headphone is not working properly. Huh.
Sarah, can Venerable
see.
hear you?
Yeah, no, he cannot. But obviously we can hear him.
I can type on the chat.
Oh, that would be wonderful. I'll quickly tell him.
Is
I don't know. I don't hear anything. I'm using a different computer this week. I don't know if that is getting an issue.
In terms of practice, or does one
Try again. Okay. Is Paramitayana and Tantrayana either or in terms of practice? No, no. Yeah, it's certainly everyone should do both. Especially, it's not that we practice Tantrayana and we no longer practice but Paramitayana. That would be like saying we no longer practice generosity, we no longer practice patience. So we absolutely have to have both. But it's just a matter of it's conceptually distinguished this way so that we can have a better understanding of what we're doing and not mix them up. But at the same time, to what extent we can, we try to cultivate both of them. So early on, we want to try to focus mainly on the Paramitayana, learning that. But as we get to a point where we can integrate tantric practices, we can start doing so. But I mean, we never stop doing the Paramitayana practices.
Does anyone else have a question? I can quickly let him know.
It's funny. I changed the audio here, but I still don't hear. Yes. So next, there's another question.
Can you hear us now?
Oh.
Ashisha, I can
I'm still
hear
not
you.
hearing. I'm not
I
sure
don't.
why. So you'll have to write it in the chat.
He's not.
Sorry.
Can you type it into chat?
I'm trying to type it as fast as I can.
When you take tantric vows with different teachers, how do you determine who is your guru? Well, for one thing, if you take tantric vows with anybody, then there is a guru disciple relationship that is formed. So they're all your guru in a general sense. But in terms of who is the main, right? Who is the main one? Then that's very much something that comes from you. And so you might determine early on, this person is my teacher. And it's certainly once you've committed to that, you want to maintain that. But over time, you could develop relationships with different teachers. And as I mentioned, I think last week, that we can do that. We just have to know that we can maintain those relationships. And so you'll see, and maybe you haven't met that person yet, that you feel that kind of connection, or maybe you find that one of your teachers that you haven't connected that well with, you want to make that deeper and start committing more to them. So you don't have to wait until you have some kind of divine sign, of course. And so we want to see what we have available. So one of the main things is that with the main teacher, that you're wanting to follow their advice. So I said before last week, I think that you don't want to ask deep advice from two different people who then give contradictory advice. it's best to determine this is the teacher that I'm going to follow their advice, and I'll ask them for advice. So yeah, you have to see what works for you. And it may also be that your main teacher is different than your tantric guru, right? That for some people, for example, there's a Gache in their center, and they consider that their main teacher, but then some high lama comes to the center and gives an empowerment. They take that empowerment, but they never see that person again. They're mainly relating to that Gache. That's fine. You can determine which is the one that you're mainly following. I think, at least I find in the monastery that Tibetans don't have this, they don't talk about this is my root teacher. Again, as I think I've maybe conveyed, that Tibetans in general just don't talk about their own practice. They're not very open about it, and part of it is just their culture. They don't have a sense of this is, they don't identify themselves in the same way that this is me and my teacher, and have a whole story about that. But for some of them, at least, there's clearly a strong relationship with some teacher back in their home monastery in Tibet, who they haven't seen for 20 years, but they still are inspired by following their example. But for a lot of them also, they consider themselves devoted to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, even though they never met him personally. And they may not get their advice from him directly, but they'll have their teacher here in the monastery, who is just their monastic mentor. And it's not giving them tantric empowerments, but they're very closely following that person's guidance. It's actually probably the most common that I've seen here. So it has to happen naturally, and it has to be something that is reflected in action. Right? It's not that we just say this person is my main teacher, but that in our life we're generally working together with them and following their advice. That it manifests in the way that we live. Is there a difference between teacher and guru? Not really. I mean, it generally is just a matter of language. But there's a question of at what point maybe do we consider somebody our teacher in a spiritual sense, right? So, for example, your high school teacher is, you wouldn't necessarily call your guru, right? But we'd say that was my teacher. And different teachers talk about different ways of determining when you consider somebody your guru in that way. For example, Lama Zopa Rinpoche was quite kind of strict about that. He said even the person who taught you the alphabet, you have to regard as your guru. But at the same time, I think Rinpoche did say a bit about that. It has to do within a dharmic context, right? So, for example, it's clear in the traditional tantric texts, their explanation of your guru is that if anybody gives you any kind of tantric teaching, even just an explanation of how to do a sadhana, you're forming a guru to teacher relationship with them. Now, I say that actually, if you have a friend and they just describe to you how the sadhana works, that's a little different. But if it's in the position where you're viewing them as a teacher, when you take that from them, then they do become your tantra guru. And you have to, doesn't mean they're your main teacher, but you have to be very careful how you relate, how you act in that relationship. So likewise, within here, like for us within the monastery, we have many people that we relate to in different capacities, but we try to maintain a very pure behavior towards that person if they've taught us in any way, and we've had any experience of where we viewed them as a teacher, then we maintain that. But again, then I think when it's completely a mundane thing, so the person who taught you how to drive or something like that, it's still good to do the practice of having respect for those people and trying to, as much as possible, to see them in a good light rather than criticizing them and just seeing them as I use them to get what I wanted, but really I don't have no respect for them. That's probably not very helpful in general. But we don't have to relate to them in the same way as we do. We have a tantric teacher and we try to visualize them as an enlightened being. In commitments, you mentioned it is advisable not to take on too many commitments in relation to tantric empowerments. How would you take empowerments and not take on commitments if they're an option? Well, usually there's not an option. So either, I mean, the main thing is don't take an empowerment if you're not able to keep that commitment. So don't just search around to take all kinds of empowerments. But if you're really wanting to practice that, then of course you check for yourself. Am I going to be able to maintain this? Right? It's not, again, as I said, that's a bit of a danger that we can get into, that there's all these empowerments available. Looks so, this day just sounds so exotic and interesting. I'd like to go to that, but to look, is this really what's going to be most beneficial for me long term? There might be situations, for example, a great teacher comes to your town and you want to have this opportunity. You'll never see them again. You might not get this opportunity again. And they're giving some empowerment and has this commitment. Well, it may be useful to do that. So you have that connection, but you have to really check clearly, is this something I practically can maintain? And not think that it's, although they might say, oh, that you can't get enlightened without this or that. Okay, perhaps so, but most of us, unless we're really serious that we want to get enlightened in the next few years, then we have to think, well, maybe in the future, when I'm ready for it, I can do that, or maybe not. But right now, I have to do what's practically useful for me. So yeah, you have to see. And generally speaking, it's said in our tradition, not to, if you take the commitment, then they tend to try to keep that and not to try to break that. But if you have a personal relationship with the teacher, you can talk to them about it. You can explain, look, I have this commitment. I thought I could do it, but now it's been 4 years and I find that it's just not helping me. You can bring that up with the teacher and see if they have advice on it. Because it's, again, the practice is about you. It shouldn't be that you're doing this to make somebody else happy. And so if it's really not working for you, you have to be practical about that. But then before you get into it, it's best to check that if I'm never going to see this teacher again and never have the opportunity to ask them, make sure I'm really ready, to make that kind of commitment. Okay, well, I think, as I've said before, this will be our last session, but if people want to have further questions in this now or in the future, of course, you can always write. And so I guess you can write to Venerable Dundrupa, to Sheila, and then they can forward it along to me, because I know that people might have questions that they're not able to ask now. But anyway, thank you for this opportunity to have seen you all for these last 6 weeks. And hope in the future that it'll have the opportunity, as it sounds, as I said, that most of you are not in New Mexico. So even if I came there, I don't know if I'm going to see most of you, but someday in the future, I don't know. My schedule here is going to be quite busy the next few years. Maybe some of you can always visit Sarah J if you're ever in India. It's some people might find it as an interesting experience to see our traditional monastery. But in the meantime, I hope you're all able to maintain a daily practice. We talked all about that, and make this a part of your life in a meaningful way, right? And as much as possible, try to make this something that is meaningful for you, not just something that you're doing by rote or because it's what is standard to do, but make this, we say cultivating, right? That you're cultivating this practice, meaning that you're making this something that every generation, this has to be passed on and then made new, made real by each individual person. Otherwise, it's just a cultural relic, right? It has to be something that each generation makes a real practice for themselves, and then they can transmit that to the future. So it's a good project that all of us can take on, as much as we're able to both cultivate our own minds, but it's also beneficial for the world. And if we can make our own minds more peaceful, less angry, and also it's beneficial for Buddhism. I just said that we talk about each generation having to pass it on to the next. if in this generation nobody practices Buddhism, then it's not going to be available for future generations. So I really hope people can make this something real for them, such that future people will have this same opportunity and have examples of people that they can say, I'd like to do like that. I'd like to practice like that person did, because it seemed to really work for them. Okay. So with that, let's do a brief dedication. I had made that long dedication, but it's already 15 minutes late, so I don't think it's nice to go too much over time. But if we have the regular dedication, we can do it mindfully and not have to rush through it. So do you have that, Jilla? The dedication we've been doing week to week? Okay, great. We'll go back to one. Yeah, okay. Whatever virtue I have collected benefit the teachings and all transmigratory beings. And in particular, may it cause the essence of perfect, pure Losandrakpa's teachings to shine forever. May the precious supreme Bodhicitta not yet born arise and grow. May that yet risen not decline, but increase more and more. We can go to the next slide. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenre seek Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Peerless teacher and assembly of children of the victorious ones, Sravakas and Paradeka Buddhas, victorious Lozong, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here right now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings, through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable, venerable Guru, to you I'll make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of all the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway to which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, to the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, with the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam into glory for fortunate disciples. Okay, thank you very much.